Hello and welcome to AfriCanDo. My name is Estelle Youssoufa and I'm thrilled to be your host for the second AfriCanDo live debate. Welcome here in the beautiful Université Mohamed VI Polytechnique in Marrakesh for the Atlantic Dialogues organized by the Policy Center for the New South. Every year, the Atlantic Dialogues brings together 350 decision makers, high-level officials, business leaders, and emerging leaders. Emerging leaders are promising talents, committed to have an impact and to renew the transatlantic relations. So for this new AfriCanDo debate, we decided to pick one of the themes of the discussion of the Atlantic Dialogues, and that's going to be the climate crisis. As you know, the UN Climate Conference, COP24, is currently meeting in Poland to try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So climate change is real. Our planet, human life are under threat. We all have heard that cry for help. Scientists are ringing the alarm again and again, yet it seems to be falling into deaf ears. Global warming is not met with the global response it needs, but there is somehow, somewhere, hope. Some say that technology, rather than politicians, could provide us with solutions to mitigate the climate crisis. That's what we are going to discuss with our guests. There are two emerging leaders who came together to chat with us on AfriCanDo, and I'm very grateful that they are with us. So on my right, Ahmed Rashid El-Khatabi, who is an economist, a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and you're Moroccan. Thank you so much for having us. And facing him is PJ Okocha. You're an economist, the managing partner and co-founder of PS Nutraceuticals International Limited, and you're coming from Nigeria. Yes. Hello, PJ. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Before we start, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. Please send us your questions via Twitter using our hashtag AfriCanDo. To kickstart the discussion, let's zoom on the human impact of climate change and what experts call the climate refugees. Watch this video. Challenge. The 2018 Climate Migration Report by the World Bank, focusing on climate change impacts, internal migration patterns and development, uncovered alarming trends for sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia and Latin America. Internal migration is poised to dramatically increase in those regions in the next 3 decades, reaching up to 143 million climate refugees, a full 2.8% of their population. Climate migration is caused by rising ocean levels, storm surges, droughts, and water shortages. However, there is hope to reduce that number to 40 million climate refugees by controlling greenhouse gas emissions and planning for better development of endangered regions. Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change migrations, with the highest proportion of affected people. Climate refugees take shelter in the ever-expanding, congested megacities, accounted for 25% of urban growth in sub-Saharan Africa. This could further exacerbate social instability, arable land scarcity, and pressure on ecosystems, creating a hard-to-manage cycle of exodus. Learn the facts and join the debate using the hashtag AfriCanDo. So at the COP24 climate conference, the Trump administration defended coal and other fossil fuels as suitable energy sources. And they stated that no country should have to sacrifice economic prosperity or energy security in pursuit of environmental sustainability. Obviously, that raised a few eyebrows, that shocked many. But that begs a question: are we collectively failing at fighting the climate change? And how do we change the narrative? Gentlemen, who wants to jump in first?
You too.
I say you're the volunteer.
Okay.
Are we failing?
Good question. I believe more stringent measures need to be applied. And I also believe that certain nations aren't adhering to certain protocols when it comes to combating climate change. And I do see an unfair imposition amongst developing nations who are trying to develop and industrialize when it comes to imposing stringent climate change methods, whereas that's not being adhered to by developed nations. So I think we really need to sit down, and it needs to, what's applied to developing nations can't necessarily be applied to developed nations.
Are you alluding to the fact that some are now posing climate mitigation conditions to the development of Africa? Can you expand on that?
Precisely, precisely. As we know, Africa is resource rich, especially when it comes to things such as hydrocarbons and so forth. How do we harness that hydrocarbon wealth when we face certain mitigations, especially when it comes to climate change and climate protocols and so forth? If we truly want to develop and harness our natural resources and create, derivative sectors that can derive from that and so forth, we need to sit across the table and.
One must mention that you are also an investor in the oil and gas industry in Nigeria. Nigeria is an oil-rich country, but it is also, if we talk about the Delta region, for example, directly impacted by climate change. It's a difficult equation. How do you think the fight is going? Are we losing without the leadership of America? Are we in a more difficult place, beyond, the obvious? But what sort of consequences does this have?
I absolutely think we're missing out. I think we're suffering from maybe a vacuum that's being left by America pulling out, by the U.S. pulling out. And I think mostly that it's a question of we're collectively failing because we're being more short-sighted and putting short-sighted goals ahead of our long-term goals. And I agree with everything you said, but I want to make one point is that Africa may be rich in many resources, but it's actually very poor in water. When it comes to climate change, that's one of the most, in my view, that's what I study, the most precious resource we have. Only 6% of the freshwater resources in the world are in Africa, and a lot of the rainfall patterns are very erratic and very sparse in the continent, and that has a whole host of consequences for economic development and for being able to mitigate. And I don't think it's a question of mitigation. It's getting to the point where it's mostly adaptation that we need.
If we look at, for example, the recent riots in France, and we go back to acceptance and how people are actually being aware of the urgency of the climate change response, the riots showed very little tolerance for climate-related taxes and dramatic energy policy changes. People are simply not willing to pay the climate change bill. How do you bring people on board that fight? How do you make the general population rise to the challenge and embrace the sacrifices needed? Because basically there's no way around it. Things will have to change.
Right. One point I'd like to make here is that there's a lot of work being done surrounding how climate change is explained to people. You mentioned earlier during the introduction that scientists are ringing the alarm bells. In some cases, they may be ringing it too strongly and not providing concrete solutions that we can take. It's more...
Do you think it's fear-mongering in a way? Do you think we reach the point where it's paralyzing?
It's paralyzing, exactly. Exactly. We're ringing the alarm bells and we're telling people that we're in a very bad spot and there's nothing really we can do about it except for give up everything that we cherish in this way of living. And that is not hopeful.
Jay, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I think, yes, like just to buttress on what he said, there's a lot of fear-mongering, but without coming up with requisite solutions, and saying, okay, why don't we take a look at this and so forth. So it's a lot of rhetoric, it's a lot of fear-mongering, it's a lot of, it's essentially putting people in the corner without saying, okay, we need to come up with a collective solution to combat and ameliorate these issues that we face. And I think, yeah, just buttressing on what he said, I think that's something that needs to change the tone.
One thing that comes up again and again is the private sector that should get on board that fight. Going green can be profitable. Precisely. Is it something that is becoming more and more accepted? Is there more work to be done there?
Definitely, definitely. I think there's definitely more work to be done in terms of going green. I mean, one thing is, you know, in Africa, one thing we have enough of is sun. You know, why aren't we harnessing the power of the sun, you know, for energy? For instance, in my ag tech startup, Nigeria as a nation, we have epileptic power supply. We don't have
one way to put it.
It's, yeah, one way to put it, putting it nicely. And, you know, we have huge reserves of natural gas, and that's not being harnessed towards electricity. And we also have sun. You know, we have abundant sun throughout the year. And so on our farms especially, what we're doing is that I said, okay, you know what? We have this disruptive and innovative technology, you know, and it just doesn't sit right, you know, with myself and my team if we're running generators 24/7 to power these, you know, these technological innovations and systems. So why don't we go and, you know, see if we can install and retrofit the various systems with solar technology? And that's gone really well so far. And the systems are able to run, you know, independently outside of the power grid on solar. So I think we need to really start taking a look at that. It's also cleaner for the surrounding environment as well. You're not emitting toxic and harmful, you know, fumes and so forth into the neighboring community and so forth and everything. So.
Do you think that there is enough efforts made into building smartly, building energy efficient, rethinking agriculture, because you're talking about agriculture? If you talk about water management, what are the solutions which are offered by technology?
There are a lot of solutions, and the solutions can take, they can address different aspects of water management. They can address the supply of water. It can address the way we use water, so the demand for water, and also water quality, which will in turn affect the supply. In terms of whether, so there's a lot of thinking that we have a current deficit in the amount of technology in the water space.
What do you mean?
So there isn't enough technology. So if you look at the number of patents in the water sector relative to other environmental sectors, the number of patents in the water sector specifically that specifically point out how much innovation is happening specific to water, it's a lot lower than in any other sector, in any other environmental sector.
So basically, investors rush towards the solar industry. This is what you're talking about, and they neglected the water management in terms of innovation so far. But that could change.
And that's because maybe they're not responding. They're not, the incentives to create new technologies in the water sector aren't there, or the support needed to create new technologies aren't there. So this is I'm doing most of my work is based in the United States and looking at the creation of technology clusters for water. And the technology clusters, my work so far shows that the places in which you have these technology clusters, you get more water-related technologies produced after the incidence of droughts, which means that these technology
clusters... You need a catastrophe to then invest.
Well, these places that have technology clusters provide the institutional support necessary to create new technologies, versus in other places, those resources aren't pooled. They aren't... The resources aren't there to take an idea to the market.
That pushes us towards the next video, which is focusing on the solutions with climate change mitigation technologies. Let's check that out.
As the latest IPCC report made evident, a hothouse Earth scenario is becoming almost inevitable. With average temperatures 4 to 5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial age and sea levels rising by 10 to 60 meters, the situation could become truly dire. This catastrophic level of climate change will need the development of new technologies called climate change mitigation technologies, or CCMT. They mainly aim at reducing CO2 emissions or the impact of extreme weather by recapturing carbon through chemical, mechanical, or natural means, such as reforestation, reducing emissions to mitigate further greenhouse effects by using clean energy sources, building smarter to create adapted habitats, or engineering selecting crops to make them resistant to drought or high temperatures. some ideas are more far-fetched, such as the proposed geoengineering projects that would spread aerosols into the higher atmosphere, reflecting sunlight to get temperatures down. Learn the facts. Join the debates using the hashtag AfriCanDo.
So PJ, you're an agripreneur. Let's talk about Africa and smart farms or precision agriculture. You alluded to it earlier on. It is one of the ways to ensure food security in an arid or under extreme climates, but it is expensive. Do you think that Africa can afford smart agriculture?
Very good question. It is very expensive, but I believe with the innovations, especially if I can speak for myself and my firm, that we continue to add to it, is eventually to drive the price down and make it affordable across board. There are less expensive agricultural technologies that actually can be implemented, but then it's a case of scale and scaling and so forth. And right now, unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa, the financial institutions tend to be risk averse when it comes to agriculture. Everybody's saying it, everybody's saying, okay, it looks good on paper, but is that actually translating into funds being allocated towards the sector? No, that's not happening. So what we're trying to do is show that, hey, listen, this is a bankable model. It's scalable, and it can also solve our issues, especially when it comes to agriculture and it comes to farming and it comes to food security. And then also what you see in Africa as well is you see that young people are moving to urban areas en masse. You know, they're abandoning traditional, the villages and so forth where agriculture was practiced. And so the key we've noticed is that the key to making agricultural hip and cool is actually applying a technological component to it. And so what we've seen is that since we've started, we've seen a lot of young people and say, oh, wow, what you guys are doing is amazing. This is actually the kind of agriculture I want to practice. So it's important that governments and institutions begin to pay attention to this and begin to shine the spotlight and direct capital towards it to grow the sector.
You mentioned that investors are not necessarily paying attention unless there is a crisis, for example, in water. It's something that doesn't seem urgent unless there is a massive problem, drought or floods. Can you explain to us, how important is water management to deal with the climate crisis?
Absolutely. Water management, especially in the context that you were describing with mass urbanization, I think that's going to be one of the most important ways in which we manage water in the future. Right now we have a lot of not smart growth, a lot of sprawl, so cities are expanding. We want to encourage urbanization, but urbanization that's more dense. That way we can get economies of scale out of our water distribution networks.
We need to rethink urban planning around water? This is what you mean?
Absolutely. And then the other aspect of managing water is instilling people with a conservation mindset. One way in which the World Bank and other institutions and some water companies have used is the use of pricing. How we price water, how each gallon or each thousand or each meter cubed of water is priced. And in the residential sector, which typically accounts for maybe 10-20% of water use, and it's growing with urbanization. And that's going to be one of the most important aspects of managing urban water demand. The evidence regarding how people respond to prices is very mixed, and there isn't that much research done in Africa.
Do you think that if we go back to the rural areas, are we improving in terms of water management, especially in Africa? You said that there is water scarcity on the continent. Yeah. Morocco, for example, is one country that struggles, but also got better at managing water. Is there some good lessons to be learned? Is there some areas which are underexplored?
I think the area of pricing is very much underexplored. Morocco adopted a new type of pricing in 2014, and I don't think the effects of those have not really been studied. Usually when the price goes up, people don't necessarily change their behavior and they go out in the streets and complain, which from an economics perspective, you wouldn't necessarily assume that to be the outcome. You'd assume the price goes up, people would use less.
But the perception is that water is life.
Yeah.
So
There's a lot of education
Right.
to be made.
South Africa, I think, despite their problems earlier
crisis.
this year, right, the crisis this year,
In
I
Cape
think
Town.
right, absolutely, in Cape Town, has an amazing model. So one, they think of water as an economic good, so they price it. But they also explicitly in their constitution state that water is a human right. And the way they're one of very few countries to do that, but they also have taken actions to ensure that people get water. And they do this by guaranteeing everyone what the UN declares to be the minimum amount of water for survival. Everyone gets that for free, and then the rest is charged. That may not be the most sustainable model, but it's the best that I've seen
In terms of balance?
balancing this efficiency versus social human right aspect, those two debates.
If you talk about the rural areas, because so far we mentioned pricing, in terms of irrigation, in terms of access to water for the farmers, is there something that technology is working on, or do you think that irrigation is so far the best answer and we haven't found something better yet?
In terms of technologies, the best technology that I've come across is drip irrigation. So using very little water to cutting down drastically on the amount of water needed to irrigate. But on the flip side, that also it comes with a set of problems, and that's groundwater recharge. The less water we're using for crops, the less water is actually being filtered down, returned back to groundwater, to the aquifers. So I'm not sure. Irrigation is that my area of expertise is more on the urban side, so I can speak a lot more.
But PJ, I think that you're nodding, so
Yeah, no,
you
I
might
think.
know a bit about that.
So what we're doing, I think that's where the agricultural technologies come into play. So we're actually right now we're actually utilizing a technology called aeroponics, essentially, which is soilless growing of crops, planting air in a soilless medium. And water,
the future is there?
The future is there. And so what happens is that water, the roots of the crops are misted with water every 15 minutes for 15 seconds. And so whatever the roots don't take in goes back into the reservoir. And so what that essentially means is that the water usage is minimized on a monthly basis. So water essentially can last you for about 4 to 6 weeks, as a result of that. So it ensures proper management of water resources and so forth. So I think certain solutions like this are able to, ameliorate these issues when it comes to effective water management and so forth.
I wanted one last thought. If you would have one good idea regarding climate change or one good suggestion to say to our leaders who could be watching or voters that they could push to say, I would think that Ahmed, you really push for water management and say you need to invest, you need to think about water more. That would be one good one. PJ, what would be your suggestion?
In terms of climate, I would say for leaders, I would say we need to stop being reactive. It's time for us to be on the forefront. And, looking at in the African context as well, we have to utilize what it is we have. And I keep, and I harped on about it earlier, but definitely harnessing the power of the sun, and start allocating funds towards that, towards our tertiary institutions, exposing young people to that, and just allow innovation to come out as a result of that. I mean, I think in the next 10, 15 years, if the leaders do begin to take a concerted effort towards that angle, I do believe we'll be better off for it as a continent.
Ahmed?
Yeah, I mean, one, in addition to be more mindful of your water use and be grateful that we have, the supply that we have today.
Yeah.
We should.
But
right.
in addition to that is encouraging innovation.
Yeah.
The water sector, there's a good reason why there's a perception there's a perception that technological innovation is lagging. It's because we don't have that much innovation happening. And a lot of that is water utility companies who probably would be the biggest beneficiaries of innovation are more focused, and rightly so, more focused on continuity of service. They don't want to take a risk on some unproven technology, and no one wants to go first. No one wants to try some technology first because they don't want to be the first to mess up.
That's true.
And
So more risk-taking. That's what you're calling for.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm calling for that. I'm just saying that, you know,
One needs to try.
One needs to try. One needs to try in order to find out.
I think with our leaders, what will enable risk-taking is creating that enabling environment. You know, and you know, sometimes in Africa, all it just requires is rhetoric and saying the right things. You know, if the right things are said from the leadership, everybody else tends to galvanize around that. Exactly. Then financial institutions say, okay, listen, maybe this is things we should be looking at. Then VCs, venture capitals, and private equity, and saying, okay, you know what? Since government is harping on this and the importance of this, let's begin to take a critical look at it. You know, but it truly stems from the top, and you know, saying the right things.
So you heard it on AfriCanDo. There needs to be action and audacity, some would say. We have to end it there. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure having you. Ahmed Rashid Al-Hatabi and PJ Okocha, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
I want to thank you, our AfriCanDo viewers, from all the AfriCanDo team. Please keep the conversation going using the hashtag AfriCanDo or the hashtag ADEL2018 on social media, or sending us messages at ATL_dialogues or at OCP Policy Center. There you have it. Write to us, send us messages, get the conversation going. Bye-bye.